Yeah. All right. Well, welcome this morning. And we are excited to be continuing in our study of book overviews. And we're continuing in this. We are actually starting a new chapter in our study. And that is that we are starting the poetic books. And so this morning, if you look at your handout, I wanted to take just a few minutes this morning before we move on to the book of Job. And I wanted to do this morning an introduction to Hebrew poetry, because Hebrew poetry is a different animal. And as we think of poetry, we think of it in sound. We think of it in rhyming and in specific syllables. And Hebrew poetry does not match what you're familiar with. We match sound. Hebrew poetry matches sense. In other words, it has a thought, and then it has a parallel thought below that. It might even have a set of 3 lines that are parallels, maybe even 4. And so I'm going to point out a couple of those features this morning, and we'll kind of wrap our head around this. But before we do that, I wanted to also give a recap of something that I showed you. I believe it was either lesson 2 or 3 as we started this overview series. And I wanted to remind you of our story and show you where we are in our story. And so if you remember, we started the story off with one man and one woman, Adam and Eve in the garden. So what I'm doing right now is this is a recap of the chronological order of the Old Testament. So these are all the major events as simplified as possible with just a couple of thumbnails. So you can hear the chronology of the story with just thumbnails. So God created man and woman. Of course, the days of creation, God orders his creation on day 7. And then due to their sin and their separation from God, God causes a flood to come and floods the world. We have the reason for the flood in Genesis 6. Remember, it says their imaginations were evil only continually before the Lord. That is the reason for the flood. Remember, the story in Genesis 3:15 is what we're after. Always keep in mind our story in Genesis 3:15, because that's what drives this whole storyline is there's coming a seed of the woman that's going to destroy the seed of the serpent. In other words, good versus evil. And when that story is in jeopardy, we see God really starting to put pressure on people. And here he brings a worldwide flood to bring Noah and his family, his 3 sons and their wives, through. We see the Tower of Babel. Can you believe it? Already in that narrative. Just a short time after a catastrophic worldwide flood, the men of the earth get together and decide they want to have basically, imagine they want to have an international headquarters. They want to make sure that they can control the world, and they do so by this tower that they call Babel. We pronounce it Babel, but Babel. And so the Lord confounds their languages there. It was in their days, the Bible says that the Lord brought a confusion on their languages. They're speaking to one another, and then all of a sudden they can't understand. By the way, in your mind, tie a note there with Acts chapter 2, where Pentecost is a reversal of this, a reversal of the languages. The Holy Spirit is the connectivity, is the unity, the unification of all people through the Spirit, and brings about the idea of the languages unifying. We have our major AIJ, our major patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course, our story from there is that Jacob has 12 children. And that's where we're at in our Genesis study right now. Of course, the story really focuses on Joseph, and he goes away, doesn't he? He goes away all the way to Egypt. That's where we're at in our next hour in Genesis chapter 38. We'll be looking at, actually, now that I say that, we'll be looking at Judah, but that's the story of Joseph. He goes to Egypt at that point. That's where we get that story at Egypt. The book of Genesis ends with them in Egypt. Behold, Moses is the one that comes on the scene and brings them out of Egypt, where the Lord is going to give him all of the laws, and we call it the 10 Commandments, at Mount Sinai. Then they wander in a circle for about 40 years, and they are unfaithful to the Lord. The Lord wants to bring them into the land of promise, which, by the way, if you're following our Genesis story, you know this. They were already there. Remember in our story right now, as we're in Genesis chapter 38, remember where Jacob lives right now? He's getting older in years and he has these 12 kids. Where does he live? He lives in Canaan, and they're already there. But the story takes a turn for the worse when almost all of them begin to get involved in paganism. Right now in Genesis 38, for example, we're going to learn that Judah leaves his family and goes and he finds people to hang out with that are pagans. Remember what the definition is. They believe in more than one God. And so as that happens more and more, the Lord will always, just like he brought Noah and his family into the ark, he brings Joseph away from that mess. See, they thought they were getting rid of Joseph because they were actually very jealous and envious of their father's love for him. But really what the Lord was doing is taking Joseph away, kind of like Noah in the ark, and bring him to a safe place. But then they find out they're in Egypt, stuck there as Moses brings them out. And again, through their unbelief, they wander in a circle for 40 years. Of course, the end of that story is that they cross over the Jordan River with Joshua. We won't go too detailed because we've already done this. But then, of course, they start conquering lands like Jericho to go back into the land of Canaan. So really, all you have so far between Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is you get to right here. This is the Pentateuch. What we've already done there. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the law of Moses, and then this begins the book of Joshua right here. So the beginning of our 12 books. That's kind of why I wanted to review this, to say this in terms of what we've already done. So we start that historical section of 12 books. We're going to start with the book of Joshua, and they're going back across the Jordan River where we started from when Jacob was already in the land of Canaan. So the Lord's saying, let's try this again. We've already been here. At that time, we enter into about a 400-year time period of the judges, where we no longer are using, remember, during this time period right here of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we're using what we call the patriarchal system, where God is speaking to a family through the oldest male of that family, really the oldest male in the family through the line of Abraham. But now we're getting into a season where the Lord is raising up judges, and there's a cycle that Israel goes through. The cycle is blessed of God, and then apathy towards him spiritually. Then we get into disobedience. Then we get into basically a social nightmare, and the Lord begins to chastise them for falling away from him. They repent and ask God for help. He sends them a judge. The judge begins to deliver them, get them on the right track, and then the cycle starts over again. Isn't that kind of the way it is? When we're blessed of God, it's easy to not think we need him. And that's the cycle they were in for 400 years during the cycle of the judges. Of course, they were tired of that and said, Lord, make us like all the other nations. Well, you know our study enough to know that was a bad idea. It was the nation. How many times have you heard me say this? It was the nation with an N for the nations with an S. It was Israel, the church, for the rest of the nations that needed the church. Abraham is a pastor. He starts a pastor nation. And this is the idea in the Bible. But they said, we want to be like all the other nations in the world. And so the Lord gave them these first set of 3 kings that we see, Saul and David and Solomon. And they all reigned for 40 years. That number in the Bible is that moment of decision and that time period of trial and trying to figure things out. Of course, we have a split kingdom with Jeroboam in the north with 10 tribes and Rehoboam in the south with 2 after the reign of Solomon. That starts when we look at the minor and major prophets. Remember, they're written to warn these two kingdoms about many different perils and warnings and captivities. That's basically the rest of the Old Testament. Then, of course, we have none that are good out of 19. None in the north. 0 for 19 in the north. Only 8 for 20 in the south. Shooting a little better, but at the same time, not exactly a stellar number. I mean, I think of this in terms if these were my children. I had 20 children, 8 of them were godly. That's not an acceptable number. We want 20 for 20 on that. And the north needed 19 for 19. In the rest of this story, of course, we have the Assyrian captivity from the north. Assyrian captivity takes care of all the 10 tribes in the north. The Babylonian captivity comes along with King Nebuchadnezzar and takes care of the south. And of course, we have seen the end of our story with Zerubbabel constructing the temple. And as the story of Ezra and Nehemiah reconstructing the city, both religiously, politically, getting them back on track with the law and the rebuilding of the walls. And that brings us to the end of our chronology of the Old Testament. So interestingly, we have in the chronology here, if you can kind of restate everything that I did, then this is the whole Old Testament. So if you can kind of understand these little pictures and restate it, you have from the beginning of creation to the end of the wandering right here is Genesis through Deuteronomy. Then you have Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. Then you have the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. That leaves us the story of Esther. Esther is right here. Esther is right here. Esther is after the Babylonian captives returned to the land. Esther's family is one of the families that stayed behind. It is before the walls are built, if you remember some of our prophecy from last week. So that's the recap. I know that was a little bit quick. Then that brings us to 400 BC and the end of our story. Now remember, we've already concluded this. Genesis through Deuteronomy and Joshua through Esther. So we have the history books. So I often will hear people say things like, why isn't the Bible written in chronological timeline? In fact, I see even at the Bible bookstore things like a chronological Bible. Well, let me help you. It is written chronologically. Genesis through Deuteronomy is written chronologically for the most part, and then the story picks up right here, and this is written chronologically, and that's the end of the story. So if you were looking at see, remember I've said this before, it's almost a hindrance at times that we're so blessed. We are so blessed that we carry around a library of books. They're thin pages with easy to read typeface, and we're so blessed. But if you had these all individually on your bookshelf, you'd have these first 5 that would tell you the creation of the world all the way to the Egyptian, when they were in Egypt. I can't think of what word I'm looking for. And then all of a sudden we have another bookshelf with the rest of the history of Israel. That other than 1st and 2nd Chronicles overlapping some of 2 Samuel through 2 Kings, other than that, and other than the fact that Esther probably fits in the middle of Ezra and there's some overlap, other than that, this is chronological. You can't get much more chronological than some overlap in restating, but that is. So what that means is by the time we get to Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, these are poetry, wisdom. These are going to fit somewhere in here. These are going to fit somewhere in here in our timeline. And these are going to fit somewhere in here in our timeline. This is the whole story. So Job goes into here. Psalms is written by several different people, but primarily David and Solomon, which of course is going to be right here, some here. Proverbs, of course, is Solomon. Solomon. So I mean, these are going to fit here mostly. But they fit into that place. So hopefully that makes sense. All right. Now, a couple of things to note about Hebrew poetry. I would say probably the number one thing to keep in mind is that Hebrew poetry is built on concepts, not sound. I've heard it said this way, not sound, but sense. You know, when we use poetry in the West, it's mostly sound. Sound first, sense is second. In fact, sometimes we want the sound to be working so well, we'll go for a rhyme before we say what we're actually thinking. We're like, what rhymes with this? It's not really what I want to say, but at least it rhymes with it. But the Hebrew sense is that they use concepts, not sound. So it may rhyme, but mostly that's not what they're going for. But it is defined by something called parallelism. And I'll give you examples in just a moment. Parallelism. Parallelism has this idea that this relates 2 lines by concept rather than rhyme. And this is going to get a little academic for a moment. You're going to feel like you're in a classroom, but this is information that's so important if you're going to understand this section right here. Because right now you may be wondering, I remember learning about Hebrew poetry in Bible college, and I remember sitting there as I started learning about it, and I thought, maybe you have this question. We're going to tackle this in just a moment. But maybe you're wondering, why is Job in the poetry section? Have you ever wondered that? Why is Job in poetry? Isn't Job kind of like, I don't know, Esther or Joshua or some of these some of these historical narrative stories. I mean, why is Job there? I'm going to answer that in just a moment. And when you see it, you're going to have a new appreciation for Job in just a moment. But there's parallelism relating to two lines, and actually this could be 2, 3, or 4, and I'll show you that in a second, by concepts rather than by rhyme. Here's 3 different kinds of parallelism. One is synonymous parallelism, and that has the idea of that the second line repeats a similar idea. See, sin, same, repeats a similar idea. But antithetic parallelism, the second line states a contrasting idea, not this, but this. And synthetic parallelism is that the second line adds a clarifying idea. You say, I don't understand. I'll give you examples right now. In our example for synonymous, which is the second line repeats, it's a similar idea. Think about Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God. We want to look at the similar or same idea. The firmament shows his handiwork. That's Psalm 19:1. That's a parallel. There's only 2 lines there. Those 2 lines are the same idea. Same idea. So that would be under the heading of synonymous parallelism. And once you get a hang of this, you're going to start recognizing them. What about an antithetic parallelism? Here's an idea of antithetic. Remember what antithetic is? I'm looking at your handout. Oh, and I'm glad I said that. Let me address those that are watching real quickly. We had some technical issues. We had a lot of technical issues this morning. One of them was, as Sarah went out to send out the email for our handouts, it said we have too many people we're handing them out to, which I guess is a great problem, but it is still a problem. We were not able to get out the newsletter with your PDFs handout. So if you're looking for that, we were not able to send that out. We're going to try to solve that problem this week. But you will see this handout in this video once I can get home, and this is all on YouTube, and I changed the description over. So probably this afternoon, you'll see this PDF in this video. Okay, so sorry, I know you're looking for that, many of you, but we'll get that solved this week. Antithetic, second line is a contrasting idea. Okay, here's a contrasting idea. A wise son makes a glad father. Okay, so what's the idea there? Well, it's a son making his father glad or happy due to his obedience. He's using wisdom in the world. Good thing. But, and you can usually tell by that word there, but a foolish son, which is the opposite of a wise son, what's the result there? It's the grief of his mother. And so we can see at that point that we are giving 2 contrasting ideas. Now they really are, Proverbs 10:1 is really conveying the same idea, isn't it? But it's a contrasting way of saying it. It would be like saying, I like it when in the middle of the night I don't stub my toe. But when I do stub my toe, it really hurts, or something like that. It's the same concept coming from 2 different angles, and they're contrasting ideas. I don't know if I did a good job on that or not, but don't think of illustrations on the fly. They don't always work. That might have been one of them. All right, the next one is called synthetic parallelism. And this has the idea that when the second line clarifies or adds to the first one. Let me give you an example of something you're very familiar with. Psalm 23, 1 and 2. You could go with the rest of Psalm 23, but let's just do a couple of them. The Lord is my shepherd, line 1. Line 2, I shall not want. So it's adding to the idea. If the Lord is my shepherd, of course I don't want. Now, you need to, now when we read the Bible, we need to think through some of these things, because when I was a little kid, I never could understand Psalm 23:1, because I never understood why you wouldn't want the Lord to be your shepherd. Can you see how I got that from this? The Lord's my shepherd. I don't want that. That's how I heard it when I was a little kid. But this is saying, because he's my shepherd, I have nothing that I'm in need of. I don't want anything because he's taking care of me. And look at verse number 2. It's the exact same way. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. There's line 1. Line 2, he leads me beside the still waters. These are complementary ideas. These add clarity. These give more understanding. This is simply just called synthetic. The second line adds clarifying ideas, and we can look at a lot of these things. Probably something I really want you to get more than anything else is this idea that even with pastors, when I talk through it with them, People that spend their life studying the Bible, I am absolutely blown away, shocked, baffled, whatever's the strongest language I could use here, to tell you that most people have some idea of this, but they don't use it in their study. And that is understanding this idea that the Hebrew poetry uses strong imagery mixed with figures of speech. Strong imagery mixed with figures of speech. The Lord will breathe out of heavens from his nostrils fire and smoke and all this. The earth will shake and the mountains are trembling and split this mountain in half. And you're reading it going, now our Western mind tends to be, we tend to read things in a very wooden, literal sense or structure. We oftentimes will miss when the Bible is using these. And these are called figures of speech. And there are a lot of them. There's a lot more than I have listed here. I just listed 10 that I thought of off the top of my head that are used often in the Bible. So 10 figures of speech. You'll be better off if you can just spend some time, and I'll show you as we're going through our Hebrew section. We'll point those out. Let me just say some that are used often, and many of these you're already going to know. The first figure of speech is a simile. You'll know this one because it's like or as is used inside of the figure of speech. I'm hungry as a bear. It's a figure of speech. It means I'm really hungry. In fact, that figure of speech is also mixing in hyperbole. That's a deliberate exaggeration made for emphasis. I'm hungry as a bear. I'm comparing my hunger to a bear, and I'm exaggerating my hunger. How do we understand that? Would you hear me say I'm as hungry as a bear and say, I can't believe Ken thinks he can out-eat a grizzly bear? I mean, you know, what a liar. I mean, a grizzly bear could out-eat him. It's such a terrible statement. No, you'd say, dude's hungry, right? I mean, let the culture allow me to speak how it speaks. Don't hold me to a wooden, literal interpretation of what I say. So a simile is the easiest one to see because it uses like or as. It gives itself away. What about this? When Jesus was in the garden, he sweat, it says in the King James, that as it were great drops of blood. That tells me it's a simile. It's a figure of speech. Now, I have heard pastors wax eloquently, go on and on, trying to explain how when you're really, really stressed, your blood pours, your blood vessels will open up, and there's a condition, and they have a scientific name for it, where blood will come out. You don't need to do all that. It's a simile. What is it talking about? If he was in the garden and he was sweating as it were great drops of blood, it means he was not sweating great drops of blood. He was sweating. He was sweating with such pain and anguish and grief that the authors are saying in the Gospels that he may as well, instead of sweat, he may as well be covered in blood. It was the same thing to him. He was about to die. He knew that. And so his sweat might as well have been blood. That's what they're saying. As it were. It's in the text. So these similes, we need to really make sure we understand this as, like, or as. 2 is a metaphor. A metaphor. Jesus said, I am the door. We're not to understand that he's a wooden structure that has a knob on it with hinges. I'm the bread of life. These are metaphors that are used all throughout the Bible. Hyperbole, I just said it. If your right hand offends you, cut it off. If your if your eye offends you, pluck it out. It's better to enter into halter. These are hyperboles. These are people that are in the West that will hear these hyperboles and take them literally. They'll walk around hurting themselves. Jesus was not advocating for you to hurt yourself. He was saying, get right with God. It's not, no sin is worth not being right with God. Hyperbole. What about anthropomorphism? Anthropomorphism. That is taking something that does not have human qualities and giving it a human quality. What about personification? That is using human qualities, like the trees will, the waves will clap their hands. Would be an example of personification. What about zoomorphism? Same thing. That's giving animal-like qualities to something that's not an animal. Like remember when King Nebuchadnezzar grew, the Bible gives him the idea of having animal-like characteristics, that claws and so forth. What about a synecdoche, number 7? Synecdoche is using a part for the whole. Like if you tell somebody, yo, man, nice wheels. Would you ever walk away and go, I can't believe they only liked my wheels? I mean, what about my doors? No, you understand it's the part represents the whole. That's a synecdoche, a part for the whole. So yeah, there's a lot there. You get it. An allegory, number 8. This is simple. This is when number 2, a metaphor becomes a story. Remember when Paul in Galatians 3 is using the metaphor of the 2 sons, saying they're like covenants, but he develops it into a story. And so in Galatians 3, he says, these 2 are an allegory, and then he makes a story out of it. So when metaphors become a story, that's called an allegory. What about a euphemism? In the Bible, there's a couple of them. Adam knew Eve, his wife. You know what that means. It doesn't mean that he shook her hand and said, "Hi, I'm Adam. Who are you?" "Oh, we know each other." Adam knew Eve, his wife. No, it means that she brought forth and bare a son, right? Or something. So that's a euphemism. What about David slept with his fathers? It's a euphemism. What does it mean? He's dead. He's dead. Sleep is a euphemism in the Bible for death. Irony. Irony is using words opposite of their literal meaning. Remember when Michael came before King David and said, "Oh, the king is so glorious. The king is so full of respect." And she was mocking him because at the time he wasn't acting in a very respectful way. Using literal words, but for their opposite intended meaning. These are all filled. Now, here's another thing I want to say. The very, very important note about the prophets. Now, I know we're getting into the Hebrew poetry, but I want to make an important note about the prophets, and that is this. The prophets use a mixture of figures of speech when conveying God's judgment. So they will use a lot of figures of speech. That's what the prophets do. The language of the prophets is heavy figures of speech to convey a warning of God's judgment. This is sometimes called prophetic language. Prophetic language. So yes, we're learning about Hebrew poetry, but this foundation is vital in understanding basically the highest form of emotions that you can give in the Hebrew world is through poetry. So prophetic language has to be understood this way. The stars will not give its light, right? The sun will not shine from heaven. The moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven. Prophetic language. That's how they convey ideas. Also, sometimes it's called the language of the prophets. Lastly, with our time left, let me just tackle this one question. Why is Job Hebrew poetry in the Hebrew poetry section? Isn't it a story written like Joshua and Esther? Short answer is no, because Joshua and Esther are written in historical narrative. But Job is written in a poetic style, and it does use parallelism, and I want to show you that. If you didn't know this, I'll let you know, Job is considered by even the secular world as being the greatest piece of poetry ever written. And let me show you just one little tool that you can use when you are reading Job. You can go home and read it and understand this a little bit more. Let me give you this first. 2 line parallels, like we showed in Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows his handiwork. 2 lines. These are for comparison. They complement each other. Maybe it's a contrast. Maybe it's more information, like I said earlier. By the word, this word colon there, like, what does a colon have to do with anything? That's a Greek word that means parts. So this is just a fancy way of saying 2 parts. 2 lines, 2 parts. But what if it has 3 lines? You ever see that in Hebrew poetry? Sometimes there's 3 lines. This is to show you, the reader, that there's increasing emotion with the person's voice. So if we were on stage right now acting something out, and I wanted to tell you, I said, I want you to get more emotional at this scene. Your character feels more emotion right here. I might put it in a 3-line parallel. It shows intensifying emotion. And of course, tricolon means 3 parts. But what if we have 4-line parallels? It's for even yet increasing emotion. I'm somewhat simplifying this. Quadricolon. Okay? So let me show you examples of that. Let's open our Bibles, if you would, for just a moment, and go to Job chapter 3. Job chapter 3. Let me show you how beautiful this is for just a moment in Job chapter 3. So we're looking for 2, 3, or 4-line parallels. Okay, let's see if you can help me out here. So after this, Job opened his mouth, cursed the day of his birth. That's the heading of this chapter. And then it says Job spoke and said this. Now you tell me, is this 2 or 3 or what? May the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. Any ideas? Number 4, verse 4. May the day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. Verse 5. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May the clouds settle on it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. Are you seeing those three? These triplets? So Job, this is very rare in poetry. The main character here is starting off with 3-line parallels with tricolons. He's starting off hot. He's starting off very emotional. Why? Well, we already know what happened in Job 1 and 2. The guy's lost everything. So we're not starting with 2 here, we're starting with 3. Look at verse 6. As for that night, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. May it not come into the number of the months. See how it's in triplets? Now, we don't have the time right now, but you could take the time to figure out whether those lines are complementary, contrasting, same idea, clarifying. See how fun that is? Maybe, I hope you think it's fun. Verse number 7, oh, may that night be barren. May no joyful shout come into it. Triplet or 2? 2 or 3? 7 is 2, isn't it? So what does that tell me? Oh, now you're seeing why Job is a masterpiece. Because our main character comes out firing with 3. But this tells us he's getting tired. In that emotion, he's getting tired. And by the time he gets to verse 7, if we were acting on a stage right now, his character comes out just exhausted, right? But by the time he gets to 7, our main character on stage may do kind of like one of these things. And he takes a breath and he thinks, and then he goes into verse 7. You see how that gives me the direction to know that? Because he goes from 3, 3, 3, 3, 2. Where's he at in verse 8? May those curse it who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. 2. So he stays there for a moment. Look at verse 9. May the stars of its morning be dark. May it look for light but have none, and not see the dawning of the day. Now look over at chapter number 4. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? He starts off with 2 and uses a contrast, and he comes in questioning Job. Now, I know this from what we just taught. I know that Eliphaz does not match Job's emotion here. Do you see how I know that just from the structure? Eliphaz does not. Why? Because he comes in with 2. And it's a contrast. He's questioning something. If one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? Hey, do you mind if I say something? I can see that you're very emotional about this. But I'm just going to state 2 thoughts. If one attempts something with you, will you become weary? But you know what? It doesn't really matter what you have to say. Who could keep quiet at a time like this? So I know this from reading it. He's not matching Job's emotion in this. So if we're giving direction to our theater actors here, Eliphaz comes off like arrogant, not as emotional, and really doesn't even care what Job has to say. Do you see that? So can you begin to see how you can, between 2, 3, and 4 lines, understand their level of emotions? So you can read Job, and actually, I've never done this, but it kind of would be interesting. You could take different markers of colors and mark the 2s and the 3s and the 4s. And you know when you get to a 4-line parallel, that is somebody saying, I have had it. I can't go any higher with my emotions. So now that's just a way for you to decode when you're reading Job. It is written in that style. Joshua and Esther are not written like this at all. Joshua and Esther are just telling you what happened. There's no parameters for the structure of the literature. It's just a record of history. This person walked in and said this, and they did this. They're written in what's called historical narrative. Job follows this pattern. It's beautiful. And there are structures within this too, because there's dialogue of these 3. Elihu comes in at the end with this 4th one, and then it's capped off by the Lord responding to Job at the end. And these all have structures built into them as well. But that's just a short answer, and we could have some fun with that. But you'll enjoy going through Job. It is a masterpiece. And now that I've told you that, you can go home and color code it and understand it a little bit more. All right, I just wanted to give you a quick intro to Hebrew poetry so you can enjoy it when we get there. Well, we are there. Lord willing, next week we'll start with the book of Job and show you the structure of Job. And it'll include Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So those 5. All right? Well, thank you so much for joining us and for your good attention. We'll be back at 10:15 for those that are watching, 10:15 a.m. Eastern time. So in about 25 minutes or so. And same bat channel, same bat time, and all that good stuff. All right. We'll see you at that time.